Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, NEDA Region Strategies for Recovery. I'll just remind you all that we will not be taking questions via audio today. We will be taking questions from our question pane. You can open your question pane, type your questions into the box in the question pane, and we'll assign them to a panelist. Now I'd like to introduce you to David Campbell, our moderator today. David is a board member of NEDA and joined Advanced CT late in 2019, bringing 17 years of experience in economic development, international business, and policy experience, having previously served as vice president and director of the Office of International Trade and Investment at the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. Before that, David was Deputy Director of Investment Services at Select USA, the federal program to attract foreign investment. I'll turn it over now to David Campbell.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Holly and Elisa, and our terrific speakers. I'm delighted to be here. We've got a fantastic program. I expect it'll be deeply informative, and I expect thought-provoking discussion on how the coronavirus situation has affected the economies in the Northeast Upper Mid-Atlantic, the 12 member states where NEDA has membership, and how economic developers are responding to the crisis. We have three fantastic speakers. First up is Mr. Stephen Jast, President of Research on Investment, ROI, and Gazelle.ai, both based in Montreal. Over his 20-year career, Steve has worked in all aspects of economic development. Under his leadership, ROI has grown into a successful international organization of 60 professionals with offices in 4 countries. ROI offers 6 economic development services that help economic development organizations, or EDOs for short, to achieve their investment attraction, business retention, and corporate expansion objectives. Gazelle.ai is the first business intelligence platform to deploy artificial intelligence to identify early signs of corporate expansion. In fact, Gazelle.ai was nominated as AI Company of the Year by the Digital Finance Institute in 2019. Steve is a true thought leader in the field of modern economic development, but for me, perhaps even more importantly, he's just a really nice guy and a pleasure to work with. So thank you, Steve, for joining us today. Next to speak will be Dr. Nadine Jezerik, ROI's VP of Analytics. Nadine's areas of expertise include analyzing current clusters, identifying emerging clusters, examining value chain gaps, and applying quantitative models to identify growth prospects among emerging companies and select industries. Nadine received her PhD in economics from the George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, which is close to where I used to live until just a couple of weeks ago. So welcome, Nadine. Thanks for joining us today. And batting cleanup, at least virtually speaking, is Ms. Kirsten McGregor, founder and principal of Sagex Associates LLC, economic recovery consultants who support all levels of government, nonprofit organizations, public-private partnerships, and businesses to help them respond to and prepare for economic disruptions and disasters. Kirsten has held numerous high-profile positions, including serving as senior policy advisor for President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, and also as Deputy Director of the Delaware Economic Development Office. She is certified in commercial real estate development by the Urban Land Institute, but perhaps most impressive, at least for me, is that Kirsten studied comparative politics and policy at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, which I find highly appropriate given that my father hails from Glasgow. So, speaker content, we're going to go in 3 sets and then we'll open up for Q&A with the group. And I'm sure you have a lot of great content, responses and questions. Steve, firstly, will talk about the effects that COVID has had on employment, investment, and trade. He'll also explore some trends that have developed since the onset of the crisis with a view to identifying opportunities for EDOs to initiate strong recovery strategies. Next, Nadine has plumbed the depths of big data to discern how different industries are faring through this crisis and how, quote, the NEDA region, 12 states, can position itself going forward as our respective states pivot more to move beyond the crisis response into reopening and recovery. Finally, Kirsten will talk about how EDOs and communities more broadly can progress into and through recovery, focusing on 5 distinct phases. Kirsten will pepper her remarks with suggestions for recovery action plans and accompanying implementation strategies. I'm sure you'll find their slides and accompanying remarks to be very enlightening. So with that, Steve, you're up. Thank you.
Okay, let me click a few buttons here. All righty. Thanks, David. And thank you, NEDA, for inviting me to talk. Thank you also to everybody for listening in today. It's an honor to share time with you this morning. I've got 2 teenagers, 1 tween, and a 1-year-old dog who've all promised to stay quiet from now until noon. My confidence is not very high, so I think we should get rolling before all you know what breaks loose in the Jast home in the next hour or so. So let me be the first to state the obvious. We're living through an unprecedented event. From a very personal perspective, I'd like to extend my very best wishes for everyone's continued good health. Reopening the economy is a crucial and complex issue involving an unusual range of risks, uncertainties, difficult judgments, and trade-offs. The COVID crisis is going to fundamentally change how we conduct economic development, analysis, how we track economic growth. My goal today is to highlight some key data points and trends useful to building a foundation for our recovery. I beg your forgiveness in advance. I will be reading quite a bit. There's a lot of data in my presentation. I don't typically like to read slides, but for fear of not remembering all these data points, I have made some extensive notes. So let's dive in. First off, GDP. So the global economy will shrink by 3% this year, equaling a loss of $9 trillion, more than the economies of Japan and Germany combined. The 3% contraction in global GDP is considerably worse than the 0.1% dip of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. In a baseline scenario, which assumes that the pandemic fades in the second half of 2020 and containment efforts can be gradually unwound, the global economy is projected to grow by 5.8% in 2021. For the US alone, GDP will shrink by 5.9% in 2020, returning to 4.7% growth in 2021. GDP data shows that the global economy was slowing before the global lockdown in April, partly reflecting shifting consumer behavior, as we can see to the chart on the right in the pink area, just next to the pink area in the dark blue, entitled household spending. A solid growth bounce is expected in the second half of 2020. But consumer services involving social contact will face a slower recovery than other sectors that can more easily accommodate social distancing. Global GDP is forecast to return to its Q4 2019 level by early 2021, but there will be long-term costs from the outbreak. It is unlikely that GDP will converge to the forecast prior to the COVID outbreak due to shifts in behaviors such as increased precautionary savings. So again, coming back to a decrease in household spending. And by 2023, the average level of GDP is expected to be 1.7% below the level forecast this past January, as depicted in the chart to the left. So trade. Worldwide trade will plummet by 11% this year. So let's take a closer look at that. In reviewing the WTO Goods Trade Barometer that gauges momentum and identifies turning points in global trade, the volume of world merchandise trade is likely to fall significantly in the first half of 2020. The index currently stands at 87.6, far below the baseline value of 100. This is the lowest value on record since the indicator was launched in July 2016. It's worth noting that trade had already been slowing in 2019 before the pandemic, weighed down by persistent trade tensions and a weakening economic growth. At 79.7, the automotive products index is weakest of all, and this is due to collapsing car production and sales in major economies. Future trade performance is best understood in terms of 2 distinct scenarios moving forward. The first is a relatively optimistic scenario with a sharp drop in trade followed by a recovery starting in the second half of 2020, depicted by the gray line on the chart to the right. And let me see if I can show that, which would be, oh, my drawing tool. Well, let's see here. Right, so the gray line right here. The second is a more pessimistic scenario with a steeper initial decline and a more prolonged and incomplete recovery, denoted by the pink line right over here. Now I'm gonna have to learn how to erase these lines later. Under the optimistic scenario, the recovery will be strong, enough to bring trade close to its pre-pandemic trend, represented by the dotted line in yellow, right over here. While the pessimistic scenario only envisages a partial recovery. As the financial crisis of 2008-2009, trade never returned to its previous trend, represented by the dotted teal-colored line. A strong rebound is more likely if businesses and consumers view the pandemic as a temporary one-time shock. In this case, spending on investment goods and consumer durables could resume at close to previous levels once the crisis abates. If the pandemic is brought under control and trade starts to expand again, most regions could see double-digit rebounds in 2021 of around 21% in the optimistic scenario and 24% in the pessimistic scenario, albeit from a much lower base. Okay, next slide. All right. Now I have a bunch of lines everywhere. Why do I always play with these things? Okay, so most governments will be heavily in debt from emergency relief measures. This is certainly going to be true for the foreseeable future. So as we take a look, in almost 90% of countries described by the IMF as advanced economies, debt to GDP ratios were higher in recent years than they were during the last global recession. As a share of the US economy, the national debt stood at 78% of GDP in 2018, putting the ratio at levels not seen since just after World War II. The recently enacted $2 trillion relief plan is expected to drive up debt sharply, especially as GDP shrinks. As we noted, for the first quarter of 2020, the US economy contracted by 4.8%, with a greater decline expected in the second quarter. The Congressional Budget Office projected that the federal debt to GDP ratio could rise to over 100% by the end of 2021, which would be the highest level ever, and then rising to 107% by 2025. Now let me see. I can't figure out how to erase these lines I made. Okay, well, we'll worry about that later. Okay, so from an employment perspective, US jobless claims surpassed the 40 million mark, meaning all the job gains since the 2009 recession have been wiped out. Taking a closer look, we note that the number of Americans filing for unemployment benefits eased to 2.12 million in the week ended May 23rd, the lowest level since the coronavirus crisis began more than 2 months ago. Still, filings came in slightly above market expectations of 2.1 million and lifted the total reported since March 21st to 40.7 million. On a non-seasonally adjusted basis, the biggest increases in jobless claims were recorded in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, while the largest decreases were reported in Washington, Florida, California, and New York. Meanwhile, counting jobless claims decreased by 3.86 million to 21 million for the week ended May 16th from a record 24.9 million in the week ended May 9th. Figures beat market forecasts of 25.8 million and showed the first decrease in continuing claims since the coronavirus pandemic started in March. The unemployment rate is expected to nearly quadruple, going from 3.8% in the first quarter of 2020 to 15.1% during the second quarter, and is expected to peak at 15.8% during the third quarter of 2020. From there, the unemployment rate will begin to decline, although not as rapidly as it increased, falling to 11.5% during the fourth quarter. On an annual basis, the unemployment rate will likely average at 11.5% in 2020 and 9.3% in 2021. Labor conditions are expected to gradually improve as stay-at-home orders are lifted, allowing businesses to reopen and increase the demand for workers. So let's talk a little bit about FDI. From an FDI perspective, indicators suggest that we'll see a steep decline in FDI over the short term. UNCTAD estimates that global FDI could decline by up to 40% over the 2020 to 2021 period. We note that the world's largest 5,000 M&Es, which account for a significant share of global FDI, have revised their earnings estimates downward by an average of 30%. Hardest hit will be energy and basic materials, airlines, the automotive industry, followed by hotels, restaurants, and leisure. This is important because a major share of FDI comes from reinvested earnings. From an M&A perspective, in the first quarter of 2020, activity is expected to drop by up to 70%. In February 2020, new cross-border acquisitions fell below 10 billion, compared with the monthly average of 40 to 50 billion before the crisis. The effects on multinationals. Of note are the predictions from executives of multinational corporations that second quarter performance will continue to deteriorate. In a survey conducted by the World Bank Group, more than 85% of surveyed businesses expect revenues and profits to decline in April through June 2020 by more than 40%. 4 in 5 businesses also expect an average 35% reduction in output in the second quarter. The employment impacts are particularly likely to worsen. 3 in 5 businesses expect to reduce employment in the second quarter on average by 25%. In addition to the likely downsizing of the workforce, the most precipitous declines are anticipated to secure financing availability by 41% and investments by 42%. The outlook reported by the survey respondents is consistent with emerging evidence on declining investment activity, as noted by UNCTAD. A key phenomenon associated with recovery is the potential continued self-isolation and depressed spending against a potential resurgence of the virus. So as we saw a few slides ago, in the dip in GDP, household spending plays a tremendous role there. So let's take a couple of seconds and do a bit of a deeper dive here. And of course, I need to figure out once and for all how to erase these lines that I made. Erase all drawings. There you go. That wasn't so hard. Okay, so let's get back at it. A key phenomenon, right? So as we note here in this slide, there's been some positive movement on this front as consumers are starting to display a more optimistic outlook. As of the end of April, 60% of respondents in the US believe that the worst of the coronavirus is still ahead, as compared to 80% the previous month, meaning 20% of the population is feeling like the worst is now behind us, as opposed to the same question a month ago. However, based on a survey conducted by the Boston Consulting Group, when measuring the willingness of respondents to resume activities such as air travel, staying in hotels, eating in restaurants, and shopping, 16 to 33% of those surveyed are already comfortable with resuming activities no matter what. Even if governments remove restrictions, 38 to 54% are not willing to resume activity. With an available vaccine and or drugs to treat COVID, activity levels will not be going back to pre-crisis levels for 9 to 18% of respondents. And this is a significant number. One issue that we've been hearing a lot about is the notion of reshoring and decoupling from China as it relates to supply chains. In a pre-COVID survey to establish the top 15 supply chain challenges, so pre-COVID, the lack of end-to-end visibility relating to offshore suppliers was identified as the #1 issue. Now, historically, US manufacturers turned to low-cost destinations to maintain cost and productivity advantages. Now, over time, manufacturers shifted their efforts towards more complex, high-value products. Shortly after China joined the WTO in 2001, a large exodus of manufacturing to China and other parts of Asia occurred. By 2010, increasing labor and transportation costs in China started to erode cost savings, as did hidden costs associated with monitoring, quality control, IP protection, and lengthy supply chains. These issues are compounded by the increase in value of the yuan, the Chinese currency, against the US dollar. Given that these issues were present prior to COVID, we expect to see some level of reshoring, whether that be as a +1 strategy, where manufacturers will keep an operation in Asia and China with one redundant facility, probably at a lesser capacity in a secondary market, or nearshoring. One popular candidate for nearshoring strategies is Mexico from a USMCA perspective. We also see that Japan has created a very aggressive grant scheme to encourage their manufacturers to leave China and reshore back to Japan. We also see recently developments in India, whereby the Indian government is spending tremendous amounts of money to develop mega industrial parks in anticipation of companies wanting to leave China and decouple China in favor of India and staying in the Asian marketplace to serve that market. We need to remember that many of the operations in China are to serve the huge Chinese and Asian marketplace. So it's not so easy to just simply say that we're going to reshore or nearshore. When we take a look at all the potential jobs, it is, however, extremely interesting. Estimates show a potential for a whopping 6 million cumulative jobs that can be reshored to the US. This assumes that 2 supported jobs are created for every 1 manufacturing-related job reshored. This scenario assumes that Chinese wages continue to rise by about 18% per year, that the US workforce can be trained up to Industry 4.0 standards, which is going to be costly and will be quite an initiative. The US competitive tax rates are introduced, and a cessation of foreign currency manipulation takes place. But clearly, the creation of 6 million jobs is very enticing. So what do we see moving forward, given all that we've just talked about? Well, from a company perspective, we know that companies are investment weary. They're very focused on net income and revenue, on regionalization, on reevaluating value chains and subsegments, increased automation and digitization. We probably will see a reduction in investment in FDI. So when we add these two together, it tells us as an economic development community that we need to revise our strategy that we had in place in advance of the crisis. Your stakeholders know, and I'm talking to an economic development crowd, that capital investment and job creation results will be lower than expected this year. This is simply inevitable. It is a truth that we must come to grips with. The most important key performance indicator for economic development organizations, as far as I'm concerned, is the adjustment to your strategy in an efficient and effective manner, as opposed to capital investment and job creation, which of course is what we're all working towards. So let's take a closer look at some of the challenges, thought processes, and strategies that companies will be thinking of moving forward, and how we can adopt this into a revised and refreshed investment attraction and business development strategy. So again, companies are going to be looking to reshore manufacturing and supply chain. They may turn to a plus one sourcing strategy while still keeping some form of manufacturing in China. There may also be nearshoring of supply chain to places like Mexico or even potentially Canada. Mitigating risk in existing supply chains will be important, decoupling from China. Increase in data-driven and AI-powered decision-making will be an extremely important factor in trying to deploy technologies that will offset the more expensive labor costs in North America that exist in China. As such, there will need to be massive investments in technology, in digitization, in skills updating to Industry 4.0 levels, in worker productivity and output, as well as the availability of finance, which, as we saw from the survey of multinational executives, is going to become much more difficult moving into the second half of this year. Companies will be very concerned with employee safety measures. We know that the work from home strategy is likely here to stay in some way, shape, or form. This will certainly change the footprint for office real estate. Working remote and virtually will proliferate. This is definitely going to happen as well. How will this affect our business development strategies if companies are going to have decentralized work staffs? From an EDO perspective, what we suggest is to verify that industry and geographic targets are still viable. Are your targeting and industries still making sense? Are they industries that are in growth mode, or are they industries that are suffering right now? And where are the geographic hot cluster spots for growth? Are they still in the same locations that we anticipated them to be in when we started this year? We need to reassess your budget. Were they trade show focused? Was there lots of travel involved? What are some costs that need to be reassigned? Keep your stakeholders in the loop. I'm sure that they are wondering the same questions as you are. And as you figure them out and come up with strategies, it's important to keep them in the know. It's certainly very important to engage in a concerted BR&E activity. We want to make sure that the companies in our jurisdictions are aware of different funding programs, aware of the different means by which we can help, and we need to make sure that they stay healthy, and as they reopen, they can begin to re-engage and re-employ a lot of the folks that needed to be let go. Revisit your value proposition, your unique selling proposition. Does it still make sense given the new industries you may be going after? Ensure that your mix of marketing collaterals are adapted to today's reality. Again, if you're not going to trade shows, you don't need paper brochures, you don't need other sorts of things that can't be given away in a virtual world. Avoid protectionist policies. This is certainly a mantra for any company that's looking to invest, and strengthen cooperation with everybody in the community. The more people that we can get involved in the investment attraction business development process, the better we are. Now is not the time to cease business development activities. I'd like to talk about a lesson I once learned from one of my mentors as we were talking about the strategy of going to the bank to increase our financing tools. And he would always say the time to go to the bank and ask for more money is not when you need the money, it's when you don't need the money. When you have a strong balance sheet, you go to the bank and you say, we want to increase our line of credit, not when your line of credit is tapped out and your receivables are hurting. So I like to think of a contrarian strategy. In markets, I like to be buying when others are selling and vice versa. Now is the time to aggressively go after business and try and promote your community for business development, because others are not. Companies will start to invest again, and it's important that they know that you're open for business and that you stay top of mind to them, and that you have a full pipeline when all the other economic development organizations come online and start knocking on those same doors. You'll already have first mover advantage. While trade shows and conferences may not be available and were popular means of lead generation, there are now virtual trade shows and conferences. There's technology related to augmented and virtual reality where we can still do site tours and virtual meetings. There's all kinds of exciting digital marketing opportunities. And we need to make sure that as an organization, you're seizing new opportunities from changing FDI. There will be huge capacity requirements for potential reshoring. Based alone on potential reshoring, according to CBRE, a 5% increase in business inventories would require an additional 500 million square feet of capacity. So if just 5% of business inventories that are being warehoused overseas come back to the US, there will be a tremendous demand for warehousing space and obviously for manufacturing space. So there's going to be a huge uptick in production and in warehousing requirements and logistics requirements. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you all very much. I look forward to any other questions, and at this point, I hand the floor over to my very esteemed colleague, Dr. Nadine Jeserich.
Thank you, Steve. So Steve has kind of given us the 30,000-foot view about the global impact of the pandemic. So I want to bring it down a bit to what most people ask about these days at ROI, which is what industries are still doing well, which ones are even accelerating despite it all, and which one is my region supposed to focus on. Beyond the supply chain disruptions, we've experienced a lot of structural changes in the way we work and the way we do business, the adoption of new technologies. And that certainly has moved the needle for many emergent sectors and created both challenges and opportunities for the established industries and companies out there. So what does the data tell us about what is working and not working in the near term and beyond, which is really what I always try to start with. And that will help us really to understand not just your local industries, but also new opportunities. With the April 2020 preliminary employment numbers out, much of what we heard in the news is certainly something what Steve has already mentioned, the collapse in leisure and hospitality and in-store retail. But for massive industries such as manufacturing and professional business services, it's necessary to dig a bit deeper because there's such diversity going on in there. And also at employment numbers, if you remember the slide that Steve was showing about the surveys of decision makers and what their projections for this in the next quarter were, and how most of them really were more the impact on revenue and the net income versus employment. I think at the moment employment and besides obviously completely shut down sectors is still a bit lagging at the moment. So it's a bit hard to get a sense of where things are moving to by just looking at employment numbers, especially at the state level where you do not have the kind of detailed information that you really need. But when you take, for example, manufacturing apart and look at the industrial production index that measures output changes, you can see that some industries have fared better because of higher demand created by the crisis. You see computer equipment and paper and certain plastics and chemicals not reducing their production quite as strongly as some others. Many are very mixed, and the economic impact, I think, has not fully shown up yet in the data. We know for sure some chemicals have experienced substantial supply chain disruptions. But at the same time, other subsectors have fed into essential industries, such as pharma and food manufacturing. The data also hides whether certain type of businesses have fared better than others, whether it's by size or level of internationalization or the diversity of their customer base. There's certainly several niche sectors that were already trending well and so far held on to their growth in 2020, and many accelerated by the crisis. The short-term burst in demand when we all stocked up on canned food. While others, for example, in the IT sector, have really just solidified and accelerated during this year. So part of what really driven the production trends for many manufacturing sectors has been the shift in international supply chains. Now, a lot of changes had already taken place after the tariff shocks several years ago. But the latest survey from the Institute for Supply Chain Management shows that within a country, there's still notable disruptions. In the US, it's fairly low within our country. Survey responses were about 9%, 6%, 9% for the US, 6% overall. But then you look at, China, of course, that within China, there were 38% of respondents said they noticed supply chain disruptions and 24% in Europe. And looking at sources like the ThomasNet survey of manufacturers, the latest one reported that a good 22% of companies had already either shifted their supply chain, looked for new suppliers, or at least diversified it. However, the impact of China's supply chain disruptions is really what trickled through to America, and certainly in the media, but also the shutdown of European economies as well. Because if you look at the primary source of intermediate goods for US production, so the inputs that are further processed into final goods domestically, that don't just come from China, but actually also from Canada and Mexico, as well as several European countries. And taking those supply chain disruptions and the disruptions in their economies into account is really important to acknowledge as well. So it's really about understanding the overall reliance on international supply chains, especially once we're 2 or 3 levels deeper, the really complex supply chains. I mean, if you take Mexico's foreign value added of electronic exports, that's 50%. And if those inputs are disrupted, and its electronic end products are inputs into some other US products, that effect will trickle on as well. And it's not just about electronics. We have certainly looking at the overall dependence of Chinese intermediates. You see that in US, a good over 30% of our production is relying on Chinese intermediates across the board, not just for electronics. Now, if you couple that with the current typical inventory levels of industries that allows them to bridge a couple of months of disruptions in their supply chains, it certainly looks like electronics and electrical products are still at the highest risks between having an inventory and having a dependence on China. But other industrial sectors, such as fabricated metals, might feel the impact as well earlier than others. And Steve had also mentioned the trend towards reshoring and nearshoring. More and more manufacturers are at least contemplating it. Now, of course, won't work for all sectors and businesses. I think that's always important to point out. And it's also not a completely new way of thinking. But right now, over 50% of US manufacturers, based on the recent ThomasNet survey, are saying that it's a very likely option for them. Now, the reshoring trends initiated with the last trade war were particularly shifting production towards North America, especially for chemicals and metals and car parts. Some inputs were shifted to other Southeast Asia locations, such as furniture and toys. But overall, we saw strong de-internationalization to protect against future trade uncertainties. And it seems those companies who took that policy shock to diversify their supplier base already a couple of years ago are now actually better equipped to handle these disruptions. Then, of course, comes the question of where reshoring makes sense, both in terms of industries and destinations. General industrial manufacturing and food and agriculture were on top of the list of the recent surveys of being the most likely targets for reshoring. And according to that survey, also the most likely reshoring destinations that were cited were Texas and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But of course, just like with the previous reshoring trends, Mexico is still a prime destination, as well as the southeast and the border states of the US generally. Now, despite these trends over the last couple of years, there's some substantial international assets held by US companies. For example, if you look at the US pharma and medicine companies, they hold over 2,000 foreign affiliates with substantial financial assets abroad. And in food manufacturing, US companies hold over 1,200 affiliates with assets over 25 million that could potentially be targeted for reshoring. Now, again, it obviously depends on why they went abroad, whether it was purely because of cost savings or whether it was because they want access to the market. But certainly in the cases where reshoring was done for fairly transportation and intensive and cost sensitive productions, they're seeing now a lot that those cost savings don't really eventuate anymore, and so transportation equipments and some of the larger machineries are seeing a reshoring as well. A third zone of opportunities are accelerating technologies, trends driven by remote work, social distancing guidelines, and the demand from the healthcare sector, of course. We have seen in the past quarter already highly trending investment areas such as biotech and medical devices accelerating, but also business software, whether scientific, engineering, or accounting applications. E-commerce and consumer electronics have accelerated expectedly and are expected to persist in the new normal. While some emerging sectors in artificial intelligence and supply chain tech and robotics and even smart city technology have been basically tasked to help transition society. Automation is hidden behind a lot of these investment areas. Steve mentioned that as well before, from robotics to the Internet of Things, from hardware to software. And some of the biggest Q1 2020 deals in supply chain tech, for example, actually came from Massachusetts. There's a retail and inventory tech company, Toast, that received substantial funding this year, and Vecna Robotics, that's supplying industrial robotics. The bottom line is that there's still a mix of risky, potential, and growth sectors, but the movements are certainly more fluid for all of these sectors. And of course, some of them are not just driven by the pandemic, but other macroeconomic influences. So where does that leave NEDA, and where does that leave regions when they're trying to reorient themselves? So this first part of the presentation, I really kind of was trying to give a framework on how to think about these different drivers that are currently going on, from kind of the resilient sectors to the ones affected with supply chain disruptions and reshoring trends to the technology accelerations. Each state and each region has, of course, its own story and its own struggles and its own potentials. But there's certainly a strength in numbers and in regional competitiveness. To provide a bit of context in terms of the current economic climate, besides, of course, the special case of New York still, initial and continuing jobless claims as a percent of the civilian labor force, that is without the pandemic unemployment assistance claims, because that data is not quite reliable enough yet, as of 2 weeks ago, left the NEDA states as a group close to some of the more economically distressed southern states. But I think what is really much more important to keep track of is what the businesses are doing and the potential businesses. So looking towards recovery, business activity is certainly key. Tracking new business applications, especially those that indicate payroll employment, give some insights into how residents perceive the local economy and how confident they are in investing. Right now, the region, as defined by the Census Bureau, not all the 12 states, is trailing behind new business applications with planned wages that's tracked on a weekly basis. And it has been consistently over the past month about 10 percentage points below the US average. And that's not just driven by one state. And it's a little bit confusing, actually. In this case, red means better. I'm not quite sure how, after all the decades of data processing, they chose red as the best color. But you see, at the same time, some states moving forward, starting with the second week of May, and having actually starting to see an upward trend in business application, at least for now, because, of course, we don't know yet the impact of the reopening and how the global economy is going to evolve. But looking beyond the next couple of weeks, there are long-term opportunities to support any state and region with strategic business targeting, whether for homegrown or outside investments. Relative to some of the key trends highlighted earlier, the NEDA region has, for example, widespread expertise in electronic components and communications equipment. These are key elements in many automation technologies and advanced machinery. Many of its major metro areas are already hotspots for suppliers that design and develop robots. All the way up to Maine, there's related expertise in, for example, autonomous marine vehicles that can be deployed in this accelerating sector. Another key area of development, not just tied to a specific sector, but more of a way of doing business, is the acceleration of customer contract manufacturers. These precision manufacturers have, for example, been key in economically supporting with their products and services this crisis. If you look up the key COVID suppliers on platforms such as ThomasNet or some of the listings that are out there in terms of the top companies that are supporting the current demand, especially of course when it comes to medical equipment. Many of them are these contract manufacturers that are supporting several sectors, from healthcare to aerospace to automotive or military, and they are able to more quickly adjust their target markets during disruptions compared to companies that supply just one sector and that tend to be located closer to the end customer or the tier 1 suppliers, and are more susceptible to specific sector downturns. Key location factors for these companies are mainly a robust workforce program, especially for integrating manufacturing with technology skills. Reshoring opportunities are also on everybody's mind, of course, especially for the medical sector. Now, not everybody, can be the next medical technology hub, but it's also a very diverse sector and it has a very large supply chain. What companies in that field that are bringing back operations are looking for, of course, a strong ecosystem of existing companies and a skilled workforce and pipeline above all. And that was often a reason for moving abroad for higher skill operations. But you still have to provide a cost-effective location with competitive labor, real estate or construction and utility costs. The East Coast can certainly offer in many regions these assets, as well as the international transportation access these companies are looking for, especially for distribution. NEDA, of course, has a significant existing pharma industry that can provide the confidence for companies and returning workers that they're going to have solid career opportunities and an ecosystem where they can spin off new ideas, and have a presence of highly skilled workers in fields like bioinformatics and genetics, but also coupled with support fields, which is really important these days, like government affairs and regulation and compliance. And not just Massachusetts, but also, for example, Maine and New Hampshire have seen a growth in resident life science workers over the past years that has exceeded most other US states. In addition, of course, you offer the research ecosystem that's so crucial for innovation. As large companies in the life sciences increasingly outsource innovation, providing the institutions and workforce able to spin off pioneering startups and growth companies will be key to not just attract, but retain future anchor companies of all sizes. Beyond the workforce and R&D that you have to offer, there's of course the case for the business cost savings in combination with the quality of your ecosystem. With the property and utility costs for a typical biopharma project, so that's here, about 350 employees, 240,000 about square feet of industrial space, and about 25,000 square feet of office space, we can see many NEDA states surpassing key competitor states such as North Carolina. The combination of a wider regional world-class ecosystem with smaller cost-competitive regions that can access it within an hour or two of drive can provide a really compelling regional story. The last targeting strategy is focused on supporting economic diversity, which is what many regions this year have learned. Smaller emerging industries such as education technologies have, for example, been accelerated by the pandemic worldwide. While existing education and publishing companies have certainly made moves to serve the exploding demand, many startups have provided innovative alternatives, from remote learning to virtual training, and not just for the consumer, but also the business market. Boston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. are seen as the 3 of the top 13 global emerging edtech hubs. And that's not surprising, of course, given that 7 out of the top 10 states and post-secondary education jobs are actually located in the Northeast. So where does that leave the NEDA region going forward? Even more so than before, regions, states, and cities have to be able to carve out this story with the best fit to their regional assets. And with that many uncertainties and workforce fluctuations, regional approaches to business growth and attraction will prove to be more robust, in my view. There's just too many moving parts. But many of you probably feel that they're not in a position to even think about business attraction right now. Although, as Steve mentioned, you can never let your guard down. You always have to keep on knocking on people's doors. But getting to that point, I think, is where our next speaker, Kirsten McGregor, will guide you through support systems and processes in your recovery strategy to get you back on track. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about the economic disruption process, how to best position your organization and your community for federal funding and philanthropic funding, and how you can approach economic injury assessments and the actions you can take right now to build a strong foundation for recovery. So this is the FEMA recovery continuum timeline. They use this for all disasters, but they actually include this with pandemics. They thought about pandemics when they came up with this recovery timeline. But you could also use it for like when you get warn notices for sudden and severe loss of jobs. But here we have this is just the typical timeline. You see the disaster there. I'm going to refer to it as a disruption since so much of what's going on is economic in nature, so it's not a natural disaster. So I'm using the word disruption. That's what triggers the response phase. What you think about, like the actions that take place right after a disaster. We're also going to talk about how in a couple slides about how COVID is a little unique, well, very unique with this timeline, but the phases still apply. So you have the short-term response, and then you start going into different phases of recovery. They are interrelated, as you can see there. The actions that you would take in the days and weeks following the disaster or the disruption, and then you have an intermediate, which is weeks and months, and then you have long-term, which is months and years, and in our current situation, it will be years. But you can see there too that they have preparedness, and that's ongoing, whether before a disaster or disruption even hits. But you need to consider this as we're in the response and recovery phases now. So I say that because Puerto Rico had an earthquake shortly, a pretty sizable earthquake shortly after the lockdowns were starting. NOAA has reported that this is going to be a much more challenging hurricane season, but it's not going to take a hurricane or an earthquake to make your economic recovery and economic reopening strategies challenging. We're so vulnerable right now that it could take much smaller issues, as we've seen with some of the issues recently in certain communities, and how that can impact your local ecosystem. Or power outages, things with Wi-Fi, with cell towers not working, with everybody working remote. Of course, this has an impact on your economy. So the business continuity is something that needs to be taken seriously, and really has been in disaster-prone areas, but not as much in areas that haven't experienced these types of disruptions on a regular basis. So that's something we need to think about with this timeline. So just to look at how COVID is a little different, the disruption and response phases are obviously still going on, but and that's when you're focusing on the immediate impacts and you want to respond. And when we think about response here, obviously the pandemic itself, there needs to be a response to that with the public health. But for the economic impacts, you need to start thinking about the reopening strategies. And in the NEDA region, we've got the recovery task force that's led by the different states' governors. So that's the first. I think they're doing it out west as well for staging reopening and coordinating together with the different states. But what's interesting is the response is going on the same time as the disruption, because we're still in lockdown in many places. We're not fully open. In some areas, cases are still increasing, actually. So unlike a typical natural disaster, the response is going on the same time as the disruption. And this, you're going to see throughout the slides why this is important, because we're dealing with response and everybody's running around, but the approach for response is very different than recovery. It's a different strategy and mindset, but they're all interrelated and overlapping, as you can see in this chart. but even more so with COVID, because this has been going on for so long. We need to start dealing with the reopening, but we also need to start looking long-term about recovery. So we need to start being in the place where we're setting the foundation for recovery. So when you start getting to the actual intermediate and long-term recovery stages, there's a lot of different things that you can do with your organization and your community. There's initiatives that you can take place. So let's say like you can have events with your federal stakeholder partners like FDIC and the Federal Reserve for access to capital events. Business continuity training, we talked about that. You can work with FEMA and hold events for that. You could do matchmaking sessions for small businesses so they can learn how to attain contracts with the federal government, because that is a complicated process. So there's different things. There's a lot of really great creative things that you can do during these recovery stages. But the other thing you can look at is developing policies and changing those policies as things go on, knowing that you need to kind of embrace the uncertainty. As we've seen, things are always going to be changing, and you need to be flexible and know that things are going to change when you're doing these short-term plans and long-term plans. I wouldn't necessarily engage in a long-term robust plan just yet, but I would start looking for the funding for those plans. But right now there are a lot of different things that you can do. So, but to do all this, you're going to have to build capacity, and I'm already seeing it from a lot of places. Everybody's focused on reopening or response and testing, and what do we do? How do we phase this? And they're not thinking about recovery, the long-term impacts, several years down the road. And understandably, but we need to start setting the foundation here. And I think the best way to do that is, I know every organization and agency is different with how they're set up, but if you can organize a stakeholder committee or a task force or an office of disaster resilience or disruption resilience, however you want to look at it, and have that be as politically agnostic as possible with the decisions for priority projects and strategies and how you're going to fund things. I would put that in place now. And the reason I say as politically agnostic as possible, I realize everything's political, but I'm here to tell you I've seen it. If there's a change in leadership, whether that's elected leadership or other types of leadership, and it's based on, a lot of these decisions are based on their needs and their priorities, that's really going to hold things up for long-term recovery and for your funding strategies. So if there's a way that you can be as politically agnostic as possible when setting up these groups, the other thing you need to think about with any sort of recovery is having transparent oversight, because and they did this with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was not nearly as much of an investment, but the Office of Inspector General has been given additional funding for oversight of all these different funds, and they do take it very seriously. So having the funds available online for the public to see what your strategies are, and you need to be as transparent as possible in these situations. But you're also going to need to bring subject matter experts in. So I say this because a lot of people have been calling me, and they're so worried about the testing. Should we do testing and things? The thing is, that's why I explained the timeline for you earlier. There is a difference between response and recovery. And I guess the way to best explain it is, you're going to go to an emergency doctor if you're at a point where you just need to be, life surviving, you want to bring yourself back to life type of thing. But if you have an ongoing chronic disease, you're going to, see a neurologist or a rheumatologist. You're not going to see the same type of doctor. So there's very different approaches. And that's where I'm talking about having different types of subject matter experts coming in and thinking about how they work. And your teams are certainly busy working with your communities, your constituents, your business communities And there's no way that you can possibly be working with the reopening strategies, the response strategies, figuring out a governance strategy, and then looking at long-term recovery. There's just not enough hours in the day. And I think you guys are already starting to see the burnout in a lot of your groups. So it's not sustainable. So that's where you bring in the subject matter experts to come in and then leave and then come back when you need us again. But it's important to have dedicated interagency recovery staff who basically, if not complete focus, the primary focus is recovery. So that they're that person that looks at recovery, not necessarily the quote unquote czar, but people who are representing different agencies and different stakeholder groups where they're all coordinating and talking to each other, which brings me to the next bullet of coordination of all levels of government, because it's so important that there's not duplication of effort with disruption recovery for a number of reasons. A lot has to do with fraud, waste, and abuse of funds, actually. But the other is just good governance, right? So you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And as Steve mentioned, that the stakeholder engagement is still huge. You need to keep in touch with your communities, keep in touch with your businesses, and do what you can to help them. I'm also going to say, not everybody on this call fits this, but places like Florida and Texas, which are disaster prone, are familiar with disaster supplementals. And I know that this is different, but what I've noticed is that communities that have never had to apply for disaster funding, they've never had to work with different federal agencies because they weren't eligible for those funding sources before, there's a little bit more of a learning curve. And the thing is, the timelines are really short, and I'll be talking about funding in a minute. The timelines are short with these supplementals. I know for a fact that, I don't know if you're on this actual webinar, but people have been reaching out to me kind of freaking out because things are due in 2 weeks, or they need to get the money on the street by the end of the year. So the timing of this is really important. And that's why I mentioned the subject matter experts and having dedicated interagency staff. Let's see. So, your first step after developing some sort of governance and oversight committee or task force is having an economic impact or injury assessment. A lot of people call it different things. Every single grant application, for the most part, is going to want to see the nexus between the disruption, in this case COVID, to the application that you're developing, right? So they're going to want to see outcome, they're going to want to see data so that they can see, pre-application and then what happened, a couple of years later, that they're able to measure outcomes. And that's where, that works with what Nadine was proposing just a few slides ago, that's such important information. And you also just need to have a basic assessment for we'll talk in another couple of slides. So you know what your vision, if you need to recreate an economic vision, you need to know what kind of industries you should be thinking about that maybe you never thought about before. The thing that people haven't really been talking about, which I think is really interesting, is disasters they highlight pre-existing vulnerabilities of communities. So it's basically like ripping a Band-Aid off something that should have had stitches and surgery like years ago, and you can't put that Band-Aid back on anymore. So you're going to have to address these vulnerabilities that just haven't been dealt with for whatever reason, whether it be budget or political sensitivity or just not enough hours in the day type of thing. These things are going to have to be dealt with, at least addressed, studied, because you're not going to be able to embrace a full recovery strategy unless you look at those. And those aren't necessarily linked directly to COVID or to the economic disruption. So we talked about quantitative data, which I think all that they talked about earlier with ROI is all fantastic stuff. But you also want to have the qualitative data that we talked about. The thing that I know that you're all doing surveys and focus groups, and that's fantastic. what I would caution you on is meeting and survey fatigue. This is going to be going on for a couple of years. I mean, I've worked in places, over 2 years after a disaster. They're going to start getting ticked off, quite frankly, and not want to participate. So you're not going to get the quality of response that you want, or the level of participation that you need. So it really is important that you approach the qualitative data outreach in a coordinated fashion. Be strategic about it. Think about all the other organizations that you work with that may be sending similar surveys out, or having focus groups, so that you're not duplicating efforts all the time. So not surprisingly, this is what everybody's been really focused on. Most of my engagements with communities, EDOs, government agencies has been about the funding. Because how are you going to fund any of the things that we've been talking about if you're looking at your budget and you're thinking, oh God, I'm going to have to, lay people off, or, my budget's it's going to be half the size. How can I even think about, doing any of these things? So I would switch that mindset, and I know it's easy for me to say that, but I've been through it enough that there is a lot of money out there. I mean, there's $2 trillion out there with different agencies. There's $1.5 billion with US EDA, and that's their biggest allocation ever. So, and that's just unprecedented. Granted, it's not enough, but if you're situating yourself where you can identify your priority projects and how to leverage resources and work with your stakeholder groups to identify the appropriate federal funding sources, and how you can leverage different sources for local match, because in some cases you still are going to be required to pony up some of your local share to match the federal grant. You really need to start looking pretty universally at how you look at funding. Your state, county, municipality, in some cases they got treasury money, non-competitive. It needs to be spent by the end of the year. That may be something that you could benefit from. So partnering with groups and seeing what kind of funding that they're able to get. Something else I've noticed is the uptick in philanthropy for economic development and economic issues, because unlike other disasters, obviously the economy is always impacted, otherwise I wouldn't be in a job, but the economy is typically down the road. The economic impacts are down the road. With COVID, it's one of the top issues, right? So I've seen high net worth individuals, family foundations, and community foundations and philanthropies really kind of pivot how they're doing their funding, and a lot of it is aimed towards economic and community development. And so a lot of the groups that I've worked with are not familiar with how to use those funding sources, or even how to go about that. So think about that. You also need to track the funding and be transparent. We talked about that because the Office of Inspector General. And once you figure out your priority projects, I would encourage you to figure out, like, what are your pain points right now, and how can you address them right away? And we talk about doing that in an action plan. But then think about long-term and projects that can help you in the long term. You're also going to figure out what's the best organization to champion these grants, these grant opportunities, because it may not necessarily be you, or maybe there's another group that can be the primary applicant and you're the co-applicant. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't benefit from it, but it might be a good idea to spread it out, just based on the mission and the terms and agreements necessary of the grant. So there's appropriate resources for appropriate groups, but it doesn't mean that you can't benefit from it. And I would encourage you to talk to agencies and organizations that you don't typically talk to, because with this, there's going to be funding that would benefit you that you're just not even aware of. So obviously there's so much COVID money that people aren't thinking about. I know everybody on this call should be focused on the EDA money, but they're not the only game in town. I mean, there are a lot of other funding sources that you can consider. So there's also non-COVID money that's still out there that, USDA had a grant announcement out in January, obviously before COVID, about broadband expansion for rural areas. And then it was extended for their second round in March. So there's agencies that you may not even think of. EPA, I mean, they all have programs. Some of them are CARES funding, some of it's their traditional funding, but you need to start leveraging those resources and make yourself aware of those resources. And I know it's overwhelming, but that's why there's people who know how to do this to save you with that. So save that time. So finally, you know, when I say set the foundation for recovery, most people think about, you know, the comprehensive economic development strategies and a recovery plan. A recovery plan is essentially like a SEDS, but is focused on recovery. You could also look at your SEDS and revise it to really focus on resilience. You may also have to revise it based on, you know, the new industry trends that we talked about earlier in this presentation with ROI. You know, so the long-term strategies, as you know, are very in-depth and longer term. I will say that though, the difference between a typical economic development strategy versus something that's involving recovery is the speed which you have to do it. Because, you know, you heard me a couple slides ago, some of this money has to get out on the street right away. And some organizations were invited by EDA as an example for a non-competitive grant. And that's why I was getting so many phone calls recently, because that money, they need to respond to EDA within a couple weeks about how they're planning on working with that money. So, and there's different ways that you can use that money, whether it's really great to think about it for capacity building for your organization. And I know that a lot of you guys are concerned about that. So thinking about different strategies there. Also revolving loan funds, I think that, you know, EDA does that, but there's also other agencies that do that. So thinking about that and how you can support your small businesses. So, you know, the EDA thing is important, but I want to stress that there's so many other funding sources out there, and you're also going to have to look at local share in some cases. So you're going to have to figure out how to balance that money out. So that's basically, let's see, that's basically what I have here. So I'll change it over to the host. For questions.
Okay, David, I believe is going to, has a few questions to share with us. David, I just unmuted you, and I'm unmuting each of our guests, and you can turn your webcams back on if you like, folks.
Great. So thank you so much, speakers. That was just, wow, so amazing. So much we could talk about. We could be here for a long time. Before we wait for your questions, so get your typing fingers out. I wanted to make sure to share contact information for us. So let me chat everyone with our respective emails. I'll put that up here in a second. Let's see, let me make sure this goes to all. Where is their all? Center. Well, I'm not, Holly, do we have a send to all option for a chat or no?
Our questions are in, we do not, David. We're asking answering our questions live, and the questions are being entered in the question pane.
Okay.
We have none in the question pane at this point.
Okay, great. So let me go first. And Kirsten, let me maybe start with you. This is perhaps a bit of a specific question, but you made a lot of really good points, among other that it's not just the Economic Development Administration that provides really helpful funding, of course, with requirements and timing, but other agencies. You mentioned, for instance, broadband, and I think work from home and connectivity and so forth, broadband, I think, is even more relevant. It was already relevant. So my question is, you mentioned USDA and rural, and I think for the 12 states here, we might think of ourselves, if someone says rural, they might think of Kansas or Nebraska and not Rhode Island or Delaware. But of course, we have agricultural land and we have folks that don't just live in suburbs or cities. Do you know if how rural is ascribed for broadband and USDA, if any of the 12 member states we're talking about could potentially qualify, or does it really have to be like Nebraska or Kansas?
Yeah, oh, absolutely not. I mean, even parts of New Jersey qualify. So it's about density and it more than anything of the population. So if you have certain census tracts that qualify that way, of course, you know, it's not a blanket answer. You need, it's very like, so where I live in Delaware, you know, it's very, very urban. I'm right outside of Philadelphia, but yes, downstate is very rural. So you need to just take it case by case. But now, I know when people think about USDA, they think about out west, or you know, but there's parts of New Jersey that qualify as an example. So
even New Jersey, right? Steve, second one back to you. Again, just so much in each of these amazing presentations. I'm really interested in particular in the reshoring and supply chain in Asia, specifically China. You mentioned between the tariff 232 and the other ongoing disputes, especially between us and China, but also the European Union to some extent, that there already were disruptions. But I'm thinking of your comments there and also on Nadine's slide that showed a 38% disruption in China's supply chain, I think as of March. And I'm wondering if that might just be, that 38% might be largely because COVID appears to have originated in China, so they had the first economic shocks. But more broadly, Steve, do you really think that the trends before COVID will really get accelerated and enhanced, and we may be able to see more reshoring back to the United States, where despite the fact that costs have gone up in China and the yuan is appreciated and all the things you mentioned, it still remains a very difficult decision, and in not least notional terms, Asia, including China, remains a lot cheaper than most of the United States. Do you think that there's a play there? And then do you think some of the NEDA states that have suffered a little bit more disproportionately from manufacturing trends over the last several decades have a chance to compete there?
I do. It's not going to be something, I don't believe, that's going to be able to take place from one day to the next. Companies are currently using supply chain and manufacturers that are in China. So it will take time to identify other sources. Certainly, if they want to bring some of these activities in-house, that's going to take some logistics and some planning, which typically, in my experience, can take anywhere from 18 to 36 months to go through a site selection process, design infrastructure, to take on this kind of an action and activity in-house in a multinational corporation. So I do believe that it's possible. And as I've been reading different surveys from companies, I see some surveys where they say that 75% of those who responded are very happy with their supply chain as they exist. And then I read other surveys who say the opposite. So there's the Reshoring Institute, and they have their data, and there's other folks that also present data. At the end of the day, I think that it makes most sense to adopt a +1 strategy. So you've got some level of redundancy. But I think what we also need to keep in mind, aside from the deteriorating relationship between China and the US, which is as much a political issue as it is a business issue, a lot of the facilities that are in Asia are there to serve the Asian marketplace. They're not necessarily there to be repatriated back to the US, which would then incur the same transportation costs shipping product back to Asia. A lot of the facilities in China as well are secondary processing facilities of rare earths and rare minerals that are mined in China. China controls 90% of the rare mineral, rare earth mining market. So if there's a disruption in that line of business, there's going to be a disruption to supply chain for technology companies, irrespective of where final product and assembly is taking place. So it's not a black and white issue. There's definitely some level of reshoring that can take place. You know, a lot of the US workforce has been trained in different ways. So there would need to be a significant exercise to bring up the manufacturing workforce to 4.0 skill sets. So that would need to take place. And I think there's another big question. As I showed on my slide, upwards of 6 million jobs would get created. If we were to turn the clocks back 3 months ago when we were sitting around 3.7, 3.8% unemployment, I don't know where we're going to get 6 million people to do those jobs. I think part of the evolution of the US economy was to move into more complex manufacturing for higher value products was done on purpose. So I think we need to be careful as we consider whether we really want those kinds of jobs back. So is it a question of reshoring, or is it a question of nearshoring, where we can have some of those jobs and some of those manufacturing activities take place in a location like Mexico? Perhaps if we're not happy with a location in China, we can look towards the Philippines, we can look towards India, because we do still need to continue to service the Asian marketplace. So it's a tough question to answer in a couple of snapshot sentences, but there is opportunity. But I don't know if corporate leaders are as excited about reshoring as the politicians and economic development professionals are when they see these great employment numbers that can come back our way. Same time, China is nowhere near as cost effective as they were, right around the time when they joined the WTO. That's for sure.
Sure, thank you. So it looks like we have a question for Dr. Nadine. Let me see. I noticed that the furniture supply chain has great risk. Do you believe this will rectify itself prior to a potential surge in demand for work at home furniture ?
Yeah, it's interesting because I just had a review for one of our clients who's in the office furniture market. What the disruptions are there. I think it's not any different than a lot of those industries that have seen basically the shift in the way we work and live. So the switch to office furniture, I think a lot of it has had to, and general furniture, there will be short-term boosts and a switch between the channels, the sales channels, in terms of wholesale and in terms of business to business versus directly from manufacturers to consumers, which not all manufacturers are set up for, certainly. But I think just like with computer equipment, I mean, that has come to the top because everybody has to have now their laptops at home and a couple of iPads for the kids and so on. And the new routers and anything you can kind of get your hands on to make it through this. But a lot of I think the work will not go back to the office in a lot of the business services. I know even in our office months ago, Steve already did like a quick survey and said, if you had the choice, who raise your hand, who would go back full time and would want to come back, or if you had the choice, would you want to work from home? And I think there were quite a few who said, well, I come maybe 1 day a week or 2 days a week, but the rest would be great if I could work from home. And that affects then, of course, those markets as well that serve both on the office side, the institutional furniture and office furniture, and then at the same time on the private market, the home office furniture as well. And I think, that's probably going to settle in the next couple of months, maybe 4 or 5 months when the businesses have decided how they're going to operate. I think that's really what it comes down to. And that's where we'll see how it kind of flattens out and where it finds its equilibrium.
Yeah, thank you. If I'm not missing another question, let me go back to Kirsten for another query. You mentioned, Kirsten, as you all did, that the decline in the revenues coming into the public coffers is just putting a further squeeze on budgets that are already tight, state, local municipalities, and a lot of EDOs that are public sector, of course, are very much grappling with that, even as private sector EDOs that have member funding might have similar concerns from a sort of a different funding source. So my question to you, Kirsten, is you mentioned a lot of available federal funding, and there might be some state level funding, but and you also mentioned philanthropy. Maybe you could sort of re-articulate what can EDOs that already were feeling a bit of a cash pinch do or think about to try and balance a need to try and upskill to retrain workers, which is investment and a return on investment, but tough to get water out of a stone if you don't have those dollars to begin with. Any sort of experiences or anecdotes you can share for the group?
Yeah, so and that's a great question, because first of all, we are in a unique situation where we're doing response and recovery at the same time, so that is unique. I just want to make that, if I had made that clear, that put that out there. But with EDA in particular, but there's other programs where you can build capacity for your organization with staffing and training and And with these, they've actually, EDA has been focusing on recovery coordinators. So you could have people who are just focused on recovery, for a few years, and maybe for looking at your staffing situation that way. And that's just EDA, but there's other programs as well. But building capacity, I think, is something that particularly these non-competitive invitation grants that went out from US EDA are focused on. So I wouldn't necessarily think about infrastructure projects. And I'm glad that a lot of the people who've been reaching out to me are not just focused on infrastructure. They are important, but I think to your point, we're going to need to start thinking about how to build capacity and keep that capacity within our organizations, because the need is going to just increase for our economic developers. So yeah, they need to start looking at, now again, the funding, they do have to apply for it, but a lot of the groups already got an invitation for 100% non-competitive grant. And then looking how you can leverage with other, I use that word a lot, I know I do, but I really can't say it enough, because there's just so much money out there where you can partner with other organizations and use and work with their money as well, and work on resources together. So that's how I would respond to that. But look at your pain points right now. Address your pain points now. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Steve,
We
back
do
up
have
to
a
you.
couple of additional questions. If you
I'm
are
sorry.
unable to see them in the question pane, I'd be happy to read them. The first is from
I guess
Michael
I'm not
Murphy,
seeing them. Yeah.
who says, what would any of the speakers recommend for communities under 5,000 persons in terms of economic development projects in this COVID time period?
I mean, I'll go first. That all communities need to be working on this. I mean, 5,000, of course, is a little bit smaller, but and so if there's a way that you can partner with, that's why I was saying co-applicants, that who's going to champion your grant, who's going to champion what you're looking for. You may be able to work with another organization. However, smaller population areas, they're going to need to address this as well. So there's so much funding out there that I really encourage you to look at what you're eligible for as an entity.
And I think from my perspective, I always say, go back to basics. I mean, I think you notice it when you go through the funding applications. You really need to have a good handle. Even in the small communities, sometimes it's amazing. And even for us, we have small and rural clients, that there's still such a lack of understanding what their economy is about, what they have and what they don't have, and what they have to work with, and underestimating that or overestimating sometimes what they can accomplish. And so this is not a time to create a new 10-year vision. It's about what you have right now, what you have to work with, and how can you support your businesses, whether it's bringing certain services to help them transform and moving forward with these funds, for example. And of course, it's it's really centered in those communities about BRNE efforts, and maybe even in those small communities, maybe you're on the outskirts of a larger metro area. Maybe you can start thinking about things like startup communities and business networks, and build some of your business capacity that way, and to get people engaged. And I think that would be the right focus for these kind of communities.
Great. Do we have any other questions that I'm not seeing from the group?
We do. We have one here from Stuart Arnett. Is RD or EDA broadband interested in 5G deployment models?
I'm not familiar with the actual infrastructure, but that is something that they're all focused on broadband. There's also just again to reinforce, EDA is not the only group that is focused on broadband. Even NTIA is being considered to come back with broadband funding. So I say that because if one agency is not focused on the question that you asked, there may be another one that is. So that's why it's important to customize these funding strategies, especially the ones that you're looking at right away. Yeah.
And we have one final question from Ricardo Luma Silva. Restoring is a long-term strategy, or I'm sorry, reshoring is a long-term strategy, which requires a lot of infrastructure and logistics from new factories to trained staff. How long do you think it will be necessary to be ready for reshoring? Since most countries and companies are in major department, or it looks like in major department, is there enough investment for this reshoring strategies? How these companies will be competitive when compared to China or India? Would you like me to read that first one again? Reshoring is a long-term strategy which requires a lot of infrastructure and logistics from new factories to trained staff. How long do you think it will be necessary to be ready for reshoring?
It's a tough question to ask. It depends on what industry, it depends on what activities, it depends on what part of the manufacturing process. It depends if they've got the logistics and other. Clearly, the notion of reshoring, throws away years of just-in-time manufacturing philosophy and modus operandi if we're going to be reshoring and then holding an inventory larger amounts of goods for our manufacturing process, which was kind of counter the past 20 years of our just-in-time manufacturing processes, where we had these goods manufactured in Asia, shipped over by air as quickly as possible, then out to client as quickly as possible. Now we're looking at a different kind of manufacturing process where we're going to be developing these commodities that we need in the manufacturing process and inventory them here, and have larger inventories such that if there's a next disruption in business, the next black swan, that we're prepared. So to your point, a lot of the answers to your question are embedded in your question. How long does it take to train the workforce into the latest manufacturing techniques and processes? Do we have any community colleges or universities or WIBs that can help in that process? So to me, it all starts with the workforce. So we would need to do an analysis of the available workforce throughout different communities across the U.S., get a sense of skills transferability, how deep how deep or how easily it would be to transfer those skills into different kind of skills that would be needed, and then take a look at building the kind of infrastructure for warehousing, logistics, and manufacturing. So from my perspective, you're looking at least a 2-year cycle until we start seeing some significant activity there. What can start happening a lot sooner would be to increase the level of production for some of the commodities that a company needs in its manufacturing processes, such that they can hold a bigger portion of those in inventory to fend off any potential black swan events, such that they're not so dependent on China should China go down again. Or, as I mentioned a bit earlier, if the strategy isn't necessarily to completely reshore, there's the China plus one strategy, where we have an alternative manufacturer in a different location ready to go when we need it. So instead of producing 80% of goods that we need out of China, 100% of goods out of China, it's 80% out of China, 20% out of India, and then we can slowly scale that up such that we have an alternative. And from a nearshoring perspective, we have our USMCA that's been ratified, and Mexico also presents some interesting options, both in terms of being a nearshore and very close to the US, obviously a border country, with also very competitive labor rates. So there's options aside from a pure reshoring play, but if the reshoring play is what a company has in mind, my suspicion is that it's a 2 to 3 year proposition.
And I just want to piggyback on that. You brought up an important point about workforce development, that there's these workforce investment board plans, and that, funded by the Department of Labor, and then there's hazard mitigation plans and all these different plans. It's important that they all align, because I've seen it, and it's an absolute nightmare when one group is focused on training programs for different industries, and then the economic development group is focused on attracting a different industry, and the two don't match. And it's just, a major headache. So you brought something up that goes back to the premise of coordination and talking to each other and communicating with each other, but that was a perfect example. So I just want to make sure I brought that up.
There's already an organization that has started certifying manufacturers. I'm looking at a pile of about 50 pages of documents I've been reading and research, but if somebody is interested, there is a US organization that is currently certifying workers to be a 4.0 industry ready. So that's taking place as we speak. And as it relates to the WIBs and others that can help in training workforce, community colleges are very effective at building customized training programs on a per company basis. But again, you need to build curriculum, you need to get that up and running. So it takes time if you're going to do it properly.
Yep.
Great. Well, I think if this was a football match, and of course I mean by that soccer, we'd be in extra time. So Holly, you asked if I want to make a quick plug for the upcoming event. I see you've just put that on the screen, Tuesday, June 23rd, 2020. We would love to have you join us for that. And this will be, let's see, reopening realities, lessons from the field. Reopening businesses after the COVID-19 pandemic is a top priority paired with many serious concerns for leaders across the Northeast. Facing brand new challenges, individuals in our field are working to create and implement policies and practices to support businesses in accessible, safe reopening. This webinar will feature leaders from across the Northeast as they share lessons from the reopenings. Our speakers come from Maine. The reopening has been underway there for over a month, and from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, where reopening is more recently underway. They represent state, local, and business district levels of leadership working hand in glove with business owners in unprecedented ways on safety protocols, public space management, and regulatory change. Registration now open at NEDAonline.org. Again, June 23 from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This concludes today's webinar. We have recorded this webinar and it will be available on our website within a few days. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully on our webinar on the 23rd. Everyone have a great day, and thanks once again to David and our panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Great
nice
day.
day.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye now.
Thank you.